All the best.
Yeah. So I'm just going to start with, yeah, you guys all mostly know my name. My name is Ragadeepika Pucha. And for those who do not know me, I used to be an ISERC student. I'm from the second batch of ISERC, and I graduated from Shantiniketan in May 2015. So I'm currently doing my PhD in astronomy and astrophysics from the University of Arizona. So broadly speaking, I'm interested in low mass galaxies, or what are known as dwarf galaxies. And I will talk a little bit about dwarf galaxies at the end of my talk. So this is going to be a very informal talk. I'm just going to repeat this. It's going to be very informal. So please feel free to stop me and ask me to repeat something if you do not understand that.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so what will you learn from this talk? So astronomy is like a huge subject, right? It has like a lot of things that like that are there in the universe. So there's like a lot of things to learn, but I cannot like explain everything. Even I don't, like, no one knows everything, right? So I'm just going to give a brief introduction of planets, stars, and galaxies. It is in no way going to be complete. Like each page itself, like whatever I'm talking about itself, is a huge research area and can be subdivided into a number of research topics. I'm just going to give a quick overview on planets and stars. I'm not like I am that's not related to my research, so I'll just go over them, but I will be spending a little bit more time on galaxies. And then I want you all to think of this talk as a tool to learn basic terminology. So even if you do not understand the intricacies of whatever I'm talking about, it's the like you have to get familiar with words first. Whenever you enter a research topic, whenever you start a new subject, the first thing that you have to do is get familiar with the words. So think of this talk as learning new words. You are like getting familiar with the words, and then you can learn more. So let's start with talking about what exactly do scientists do. So like when I was growing up, I kind of thought of scientists as these mad people. You have this image in your mind that scientists are these mad people who just like figure out things. Like, do they magically figure out things? Is that what happens? But that is not the thing. Like every scientist follows a recipe of steps, something called as the scientific method. How many of you have heard of the scientific method? You can just like raise hands. Cool. Thank you. So the scientific method is basically a set of steps. So the purpose of this, yeah.
No, you can continue, please.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So the purpose of the scientific method to basically is to explain a phenomenon in nature. So that's what research is, right? Research is that you are trying to explain something. And how do you do it? There are like people who are called as theorists. They devise a theory, and when they devise a theory, it should be scientifically testable. That's the rule. Like you cannot just like have some random theory which cannot be testable. For example, I give this this is my favorite example. Basically, if for example you want to explain to someone that when you open the fridge, the light switches on, and when you close the fridge, the light switches off. If you want to explain this phenomena, there can be a theory saying that there is an invisible man sitting inside the fridge, and he is switching on and off the light whenever we are opening the fridge. That's a theory, right? It's a plausible theory, but it's not a scientifically testable theory. So that's one of the things when you have to think about research. When theorists devise a theory, you have to make it a scientific theory which can have some predictions that other people can test. And this scientific theory, experimentalists, the other people who are experimentalists, they devise an experiment to disprove it. one other thing, like one important thing is that people always like try to disprove a theory. You never try to prove a theory. I think if if third and fourth year people are attending this, you might have the philosophy of science class already done, and in that class you might have learned this. Like, you always try to disprove a theory, because once a theory is disproved, you can discard it. But when it is very harder to prove a theory, so you try to disprove it. And then after repeated failures of disproving a theory, it becomes a law. So you might have heard this term like Kepler's laws, Newton's laws, right? So because these have undergone the repeated failures of disproving them, it's have been like centuries of people trying to disprove them, no one could disprove it, and then it became a law. But we still call Einstein's theory as a theory. So because we are still trying to disprove it, there have been like so many cases. I think Suvikrant is here. He's one of my batchmates, and he is trying to disprove Einstein's theory, and so on. And the result of all this scientific method is that the phenomenon that we are trying to explain is successfully explained. So let's just give this like a trial. Like, everyone knows how rains occur, right? So the basic theory of how rains occur is that we have evaporation of water from rivers and oceans and everything, and then we have steam from the evaporated water vapor condenses, and then it turns to rain, right? That's the theory. You have, like, we all have learned that in our 5th and 6th grades. But if someone were to ask, how do you prove it? Can anyone of you think of a small experiment as to how to prove this?
Yeah, we can just boil some water or just heat some water, not boil it, and let the steam collect on a cool surface, and then check whether that steam collected on the cool surface can then drip somewhere else.
Exactly. So this is that's really good. So exactly. So this is the process of scientific method. So you just acted as an experimentalist right now and tried the experiment and showed that this happens. So, oh, sorry. But what about astronomy? So astronomy, it's like all the theories are out there, right? This is like the huge universe is going on, and then theorists are trying to explain this, but you cannot like actually have experiments on that large scale. So what do astronomers do? So in astronomy, it's kind of similar. You have theorists who try to explain things, who create, who devise theories to explain stuff in the universe. And then there are observers who use telescopes to look at the things and try to disprove the theories. So I'm an observer. I go to telescopes, I take data, I analyze it, and try to disprove the theories that are already present. And then there is an additional thing called as instrumentalists. And instrumentalists are people who basically design the optical systems, such as telescopes, spectrographs, etc., which will basically help us observers with their testing. But the main question to ask here is, why do we study astronomy? So I'm sure like many of you will agree with me when I say that curiosity is the essence of human existence. And that is where the study of astronomy comes in. So we want to know the answers to these questions, such as how did the universe form? How do stars, planets, and galaxies form? How did our solar system come into being? Are there planets out there with life? And what is our fate in the universe? So astronomers all over the world are trying to answer some of these questions. But how do you attempt to answer these questions? And the solution to this comes from light. So we use light from distant objects to study the universe. Specifically, two facets of light are like really important. So you all must have already studied this. Light is an electromagnetic wave, and depending on its frequency and wavelength, it can have like different forms, ranging from low energy radio waves to high energy gamma rays. And based on the type of radiation that we observe, we can learn about the processes that happen in the universe. For example, if we observe gamma rays from some object, gamma rays are high energy objects. So we know that some high energy process is occurring there. But if something happens in, say, infrared is like really low energy. So we know that some low energy process is happening there. So from light itself, we can infer a lot of things. And another example, I think I wanted to just dump it there, is that stars, light from stars usually take the form of Planck spectrum. So black body spectrum. I think many of us have read that a lot. And if you remember, we can get temperature of the object from its Planck spectrum. So basically just taking the spectrum of a star can give us its temperature. And if you remember Wien's law says that if we increase the temperature, the wavelength of the spectra maximum decreases. So the lambda max T is equal to constant. So what it means is that when you increase the temperature, it becomes bluer. The object becomes bluer. That's why blue stars are young objects, are hotter objects, and red stars are older objects which are much cooler. And another important fact about light is that its speed is finite. So it means that it takes light a fixed amount of time to travel from one point to another. So this is really important because we can then use light as a time machine. For example, in this case, basically it's showing the time light takes to travel from Earth to Moon in real time. So you can see that it takes about 1.2 seconds to travel, for the light to travel from Moon to the Earth. So similarly, light takes about 8 minutes to travel from Sun to the Moon. So what this means is that when we look at the Sun, what we are seeing is the Sun that is 8 minutes into the past. Like, we are not looking at the Sun as it is now. We are looking at the Sun as it was 8 minutes into the past. So this time machine part of light is crucial in constructing how different objects formed in the universe. Anyone have any questions till now?
I have a question.
Yeah.
You showed that thing that first there was we proposed a theory.
Yeah.
Then we proposed the observation to nullify it. And then there is a thing that instrumentalists to doing this experiment. Okay, in case of astronomy, but is it that in case of astronomy follows the same order? Because if you saw the history of the astronomy, then first people like looks at the stars and try to give a model or a theory which will fit this thing. Like that, first there is the Platonic theory, then after that there is the retrograde motion, then Ptolemy gives a new theory, and this time is going on. It's a better fitted theory, not the theory is nullifying.
Yes, that is true. I was just giving like a basic rule of thumb that scientists follow, but in real life it gets more complicated. But still, the point of the thing was to explain the phenomenon, right? So we are seeing the stars going around and around. So Ptolemy said that Earth was the center of the universe, and we were not able to explain that. How did that disprove? Like, because of the additional like retrograde motion that we were seeing, the Ptolemy motion was disproved. That's why they had to come up with this retrograde motion theory to explain the new phenomena. And then that was disproved because of some like faraway stars and all that. And then that's why the Copernican theory came into being, right? It's the same steps. It's just a little bit complicated, but in each step, the theory was disproved, and that's why it required a new theory.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So this concept of scientific theories, is it true for empirical sciences only, or is it an overarching theory, overarching concept?
It's an overarching concept.
So for example, in subjects like maths, for example, where you don't have this observational idea.
Yeah.
So in that case, we generally look to prove a certain theory. We start off with a hunch and then try to prove it.
Yeah, I think so. I do not actually know much about how mathematics like actually research works, but yeah, if anyone knows the answer to this question,
can I comment this?
Yes, please.
on this matter. Actually, in case of mathematics, normally the people don't put the mathematics as a natural science. So this theory, what you told, it's a possibility of natural science, but maths we don't put in the natural science.
That was what I was asking, that whether this concept is only true for empirical sciences, where you can
Yeah.
actually test and prove things. I mean, test and try to make an experiment to disprove things.
Yes, I think so then. I'm sorry, I don't know much about how things work in mathematics research.
Okay, it's fine, it's fine.
Yeah. Okay, now before we venture out into space, let's talk about how small we are compared to the universe. So in this figure here, basically we will be starting with our Earth and slowly zooming out into space. So please follow my cursor as I speak here. So Earth is one planet among 8 planets in our solar system here. So the sun is the closest star to us, and in comparison to other stars, it's a normal sized star. It's just like medium sized star. But even in this medium sized star, we can fit about 10 lakh Earths inside the sun itself. So you can imagine how big the sun is. And the sun and some of its neighboring stars are shown here, something called as the solar neighborhood. And you can barely separate the sun from other stars here. Like you cannot even like separate the sun from all the other stars that are given here. And the closest star to the sun is the Alpha Centauri system. It's a triple star system, which is about 4 light years away from us. So a light year is a unit of distance in astronomy, and it is the distance light travels in 1 year, which is equal to about 900 billion kilometers. And these stars are all part of this huge Milky Way galaxy as shown here. So there are more than 1 billion stars, that is 10 power 9 stars in our galaxy. And we cannot even see the individual stars from this point. Light takes about 1 lakh years to move from one end of the Milky Way to another end. In other words, the diameter of the Milky Way is about 1 lakh light years. And when we zoom out even further from our Milky Way here, we can see several galaxies, including Milky Way, and our closest galaxy is the Andromeda galaxy. And together with some satellite galaxies, it forms what we call as the local group of galaxies. And several such groups form as the supercluster of galaxies. We are part of the Virgo supercluster. And finally, we have, yeah?
Shaida.
Did someone say something?
Hello, just turn off your mic who are speaking.
Yeah, sorry. So finally, we have the observable universe. Basically, it's the universe that we can actually see, which is made up of many, many such superclusters. Let's look at this in another way. So we have the Hubble Space Telescope. So initially, when they launched the Hubble Space Telescope, what they did was they just pointed it at one part of the sky and just took an exposure for several hours. And that's what we call as the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. So this, do you see this XDF here? That's the ultra deep field, and that's what is this whole thing. This is the zoomed in version of this small thing here. And the moon is to scale. Moon is given here to compare this small field, the size of the small field, basically to understand how big it is. So we can see that clearly how many galaxies exist in this small part of the sky. So these galaxies are made of millions to billions of stars, and many of those stars have in turn have planets around them which may contain life, who knows, right? So here I want you all to like take a pause, and even if you do not take away anything else from this talk, I want you all to think about this, think about this very carefully. The universe is made up of about 10 power 11 galaxies. Each of them have about 10 power 11 stars. So in total, there are about 10 power 22 stars in the universe. So that is 1 followed by 22 zeros. And sun is just one of them. So can you imagine the grandness of the universe? Like, for me, it's like pretty mind-blowing. So even though we are such an insignificant part of the universe, so we as humans have the power to do something significant in this life. So this is something to think about, and just, yeah, just a key takeaway from this talk. So let's start with exoplanets. So exoplanets are basically planetary systems outside the solar system. And the primary question now is, why is detecting these other planets important? So this is because it is the first step towards searching for life. And also detecting exoplanets is important because it provides some clues about the formation of planets, how the planets and moons are formed, and how our solar system formed, how it came to be, and so on. So this plot here shows basically the total number of exoplanets detected as a function of the year. So this is the latest plot. Like you can see, it was from May 2020. And you can see, and the different colors are basically basically tells us from which detection method was used to detect these planets. And you can clearly see that transit method, which is in green, is the most important method for detecting the planets. And the second one is the radial velocity method. And we have detected about 4,000, like you can see here, we have detected about 4,000 exoplanets till now. And it's mostly due to the Kepler mission, which is an amazing space mission that occurred in the last few years. Now, TESS, there is a new telescope called TESS, which has been launched. It's going to detect more exoplanets. Let's talk a little bit about the two important methods. So here I'm talking about how the transiting method works. It's basically, it's in a simple terms, basically we measure the brightness of the star. And when a planet passes in front of the star, imagine this is a star and the planet is passing in front of it, it blocks part of the star, right? And this leads to a dip in the measured brightness. So this is all the transiting method is. But the important thing here is that you cannot detect everything, right? You have to, like, when we are observing the planetary system, it has to be in a certain viewpoint from Earth to actually happen this, actually detect such planets. So I'm going to launch a poll now. Please answer the question, like think about it for a minute and then answer the question. I'm going to, yes. So what properties of the detected planet can be inferred from the transit method? Think about it.
May I ask a question here?
Yeah.
When we detect a new exoplanet, let's say by the transiting method, do we just keep the data like that, or do we also apply other methods like radial velocity and all to find other properties of the planet and the star system?
You do apply you do try to apply, that's the thing. Like you do try to apply everything that you know, but it depends on the system whether you can observe it or not. Like radial velocity, you can try to observe in any systems. I'm going to talk about when you can use it. So yeah, like transiting method, you can use it when the object is bigger enough. The planet has to be bigger enough to create a dip, right? And also the planetary system has to be at like an eye level. Like if it is like facing like this, if the star is like in the center and the planet is revolving around it when you're looking at it, you cannot apply the transit system, right? Transit method, right? You cannot do that. So 19 of the people have submitted. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Okay, let's share the results. So you can all see the results, right? So 75% of the people have answered radius of the planet, which is actually correct, because like that's very good. Because like if you increase the radius of the planet, there will be a bigger dip in the light curve. This is what you call as a light curve. So when you increase the size of the planet, there will be a bigger dip. So you can infer the radius of the planet. And yes, you can infer the period of revolution of the planet, because like if you take multiple observations, the dip will continue. The dip will follow at periodic intervals. And from that, you can infer the period of revolution of the planet. But you cannot detect, you cannot infer the mass of the planet from this method. For that, you need some more calculations. So here is an illustration of the TRAPPIST-1 system. In 2017, there was this amazing discovery using the same TRAPPIST method. A 7-planet system was found, which was named as the TRAPPIST-1 system. The system is much older than our solar system. And you can ask why these planets are amazing, considering we have already discovered 4,000 planets. So this is because 3 of these planets, these 7 planets, are basically in the habitable zone. Krishna, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. If a planet is revolving around a star or another planet, so cannot we assume that both are made up of same materials, or the density of the materials is same?
No, because we do not know whether it's an ice planet or a gas planet, right? And stars are usually made up of plasma, like a hot material, but like Earth, it can be made of rocks, or it can be made of ice or anything. We do not know anything about the density of the planet, right? And we cannot infer anything from the light curve.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
I was wondering if 2 things are in nearby position in space, so their origins should be same and they should be probably of same density materials.
The origin is same, but the density of material might not be the same. For example, in our own solar system, you can imagine the Mercury is very close to the sun, right? But sun is made up of hydrogen and helium mostly, but Mercury is like rocky, right? A bit. So it won't have the same density. It also depends on the type of processes that are occurring in the object.
Yeah, that matters a lot.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Generally we use this tranching method using brightness. We check the brightness. If brightness lowers down, then we check that like mass and size. If we are using brightness, can't we use another things like neutrinos, which is which will cross most of the planets and which will be blocked according to the mass of the size, and in that way we could find the mass of the planets.
So neutrinos is like we are still trying to figure out how to detect them, right? We don't have like a sure method of actually detecting neutrinos yet, and also we do not know much about neutrinos. There are like different flavors of neutrinos, and then we don't know. Basically, we still haven't figured out much about what neutrinos, like kind of neutrinos occur and how to detect them and so on. But if that improves, maybe in the future. And yeah, it's not possible. I do not think that's possible also.
Because the neutrino oscillation was detected by our planet only.
Yes, I do. I because neutrinos was used to actually confirm that nuclear fusion occurs in the sun. That was the reason how we know that hydrogen gets converted into helium in the sun, because we detected neutrinos.
Yes.
But it's still like very preliminary result, right? We cannot detect all the neutrinos that are coming. We just detect like part of them. There is an
Yeah.
ice cube detector in Antarctica which detects neutrinos, but it's still like we cannot measure them properly and so on.
Okay. My question was similar, like when we used Japan's heavy water detector was there, and like they used neutrinos which is directly coming from sun, and neutrinos when that place became just opposite to the sun, and neutrino which crosses the earth and come to that detector. They just found the data of both, two analyzed it, and then they showed that do neutrino oscillate. So
Yeah.
uh, in this tendency, we can say that some of the neutrinos is being blocked by earth,
Yes.
and in using that data they analyzed it and said so for
Yeah,
that
but it's also
I don't
like
know.
the star is also really far away, right? It's not like
Yeah,
we are.
like
That is
virtually, yeah.
another thing. But I think Suvikrant might answer this more. If Suvikrant, do you want to answer this question?
The radial accuracy of neutrino detectors is too low, so you generally don't use them. So even if you want to do these sort of transition methods, they won't work with the neutrinos, and neutrinos essentially pass through without having any issues through the complete earth without having much changes in them. And neutrino oscillation is completely different thing. That's the oscillation between different flavors. That happens for different reasons altogether.
Yeah, that is different thing, but I am saying it blocks, our earth also blocks, in some big planet is there that also blocks. So if
No,
it
not
is
really. And that's how actually we detect these, what you call the gravitational waves. Like in the GW170817, the first thing that we detected was the neutrino measures. So neutrinos essentially pass through the whole galaxies without having any changes in the intensities. That's why
some
they are
of
useful there.
Also, we cannot say from where it is coming, right? It's also
Yeah,
like,
the radial accuracy of the neutrinos is too low.
yeah.
okay, thank you.
Maybe in the future, right now, we do not have any such capabilities. So,
Thank you.
And the Super Kamiokande and Ice Cube are actually working on different things, though they use it as neutrino detectors, but they're working on different problems altogether.
Okay.
okay, so now let's talk about detecting exoplanets using the radial velocity method. So this method basically depends on the Doppler effect. So if you guys remember, Doppler effect is the change in wavelength or frequency when the body that produces moves towards us or away from us. So if a light emitting object comes towards us, its wavelength gets shifted to shorter wavelengths, or what we call as blue shift. And this is because the spectrum basically shifts towards bluer wavelengths. And if the same object moves away from us, its wavelength gets shifted to longer wavelengths, and what we call it as a red shift. And the spectrum of that object shift to the redder wavelengths. So basically, when a planet revolves around the star is not actually stationary. Both the planet and the star are actually revolving around their common center of mass. For example, in this here, the common center of mass is X, shown as X. And the star also revolves around this center of mass. And since the star's mass is larger, the center of mass is much closer to the star. So if you measure the spectrum of the star in this way, you see that when the star is moving away from us, like rotating in this way, it gets redshifted. The spectrum moves towards the redder wavelengths. And when it comes towards us, there is a blue shift happens, and the spectrum moves to the bluer wavelengths. And this shift we can measure as this shift can be used to measure the velocity as a function of time. So this is in simple like ways the radial velocity method, but the important thing here is that the planet has to be heavier enough to actually create this this wobbling motion. So for example, if someone is viewing solar system from outside and trying to detect it using the radial velocity method, only Jupiter can, like Jupiter and part of Saturn can produce this motion in the sun. Like you cannot detect Earth from outside the solar system using radial velocity method. So based on this, try answering the second poll, which is similar. What properties of this detected planet can you infer from the radial velocity method? Ten more seconds. It's a multiple choice. You can select multiple answers as well, by the way.
It was only single choice for me.
Oh. Okay.
Previous one was multiple choice.
So yes, you all are correct. We can infer the mass of the planet based on how much the star is wobbling. But for this, we also need to know the mass of the star. That's the thing. But like you can infer the mass of the planet, and based on how the blue shift and the red shift is like repeating, we can find the period of revolution of the planet as well. And this is exciting because last year Nobel Prize was given to these two people, Michel Mayor and Didier Queloz, for actually discovering the planet 51 Pegasus b. This was in 1995. They discovered this. This was really interesting at that time. I think Didier was actually a grad student at that time. And they detected this 51 Pegasus b using the radial velocity method, and they got Nobel Prize for it last year. Krishna, you have a question?
Yeah, but I have a question regarding this method. For this method to be valid, we need only two systems. It's only one star and the second one which is revolving around it.
Yes.
What if some others are present and we feel like we could not take into account all those things? So how?
Yeah, it is like basically some what do you call, like risks that the exoplanet people are willing to take, basically, because like we have ours is a 8-planet system, and only Jupiter produces enough wobble in the sun to detect it. So they cannot detect all the planets in the system, but they hope like maybe one planet or so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Also, as you have seen in the previous slide, the number of detected planets using radial velocity is really small as compared to transit method. So but it is actually helpful if you try to combine these two methods. That's when it becomes like really helpful, basically. I think I'm not an expert in exoplanets at all, but one of my friends works on this, and he uses theory like simulations to separate out some stuff as well. So
okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And also there are like much complicated things. Like one of my friends works on circumbinary planetary system. What it means is that there are two stars who are revolving around each other, and then there is like a planet that revolves around these things. So it gets complicated really fast. But this is like, here I'm just talking about all the stuff in the most simplest terms. Yeah.
There are realistic systems like that. Like
Yeah.
two stars moving around each other and along with the planets.
Yeah, like even the Alpha Centauri system. Alpha Centauri system is a triple star system, and then you have planets around these, right? So yeah. Swastik, you have a question? Okay.
Yes, I want to ask that you told in radial velocity method that we cannot detect small planets, or you told like only Jupiter can be detected. So I was asking, is there any drawback in case of transit method also, or means transit method can detect every planet, or
no? The transit method can be detected only when it is like basically when it's eye level to us, right? Because if there is an inclination of like, if it's facing us, if the planetary system is facing us, we cannot detect it, right? If it's only like 90 degrees, if it's then we can see it. And also the planet has to be bigger enough, like the radius has to be larger enough to actually produce a significant dip.
Yeah, that is what I was about to ask. Means how much big it should be. Is there any value or no?
I do not know the answer to this question, but I can look into it later and let you know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hello, I have one question.
Yes.
Suppose there is a planet system which has like larger planets, not only smaller and larger planets. Like all the planets are the size of Jupiter or bigger than that.
Yeah.
So combining all those planets, they will produce much bigger wobble effect. If we not look at two body problem, if we look many body problem.
Yeah.
So how we then can it be possible to separate out all the planets and their masses? Or
I think theoretically, yeah, it should produce like a really large thing, but yeah, such systems are not stable because yeah, the gravitational power, like each of them is producing a gravitational effect, right? So such systems are not stable and they won't actually exist in nature.
okay, but my question is, can we separate out that how many planets are there, or we will like if we can't see the planet?
Yeah, but if they does not exist, like at the moment, you like for example, if you look at Jupiter and Saturn, I think you can separate the effect of the two things. I'm just not sure how. I know like that you can separate if it's like 2 or 3 planets, but if it's more than that, it's not stable. And yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask, like, I know that we use machine learning to do these kinds of n-body problems and like prepare simulations for checking out what they are going to be after 5 billion years or something like that. So like in 2020, like how far are we, I mean, how accurately can we do these things?
Again, the thing is that I'm not an exoplanet person, so I actually do not know the how the exoplanet simulations and all work. But I can't like figure, like I can ask someone and no, yeah. Okay, by the way, it's already 42 minutes. I still haven't started galaxies. I hope that's okay. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the life cycle of stars. So stars form from cold, gas, and dust nebulae, which are called as stellar nurseries. Basically, it looks something like this. And many, many stars form from this nebulae together. And based on the mass of the star, it follows a different life cycle. But the first phase of all the stars is nuclear fusion of hydrogen into helium nuclei. In other words, protons fuse to form alpha particles. And this phase is called as the main sequence phase. And after the hydrogen is exhausted in the core, hydrogen starts burning in the shell around the helium core. And this is what is called as the red giant phase. So the sun is actually still in the main sequence phase, and it's a low mass star. So basically it will follow this path. So when hydrogen starts burning in the shell around the helium core, it is called as a red giant phase. But if it's a massive star, it is called as a red supergiant phase. And after this phase, if it's like a sun-like star, it will slowly shed its outer layers, and this is called as a planetary nebula phase. This phase is very beautiful when you look through the telescope. It's like some of the amazing, beautiful things in the universe. Basically something like this. And when our own sun will reach this phase, it will expand so much that it will encompass even the orbit of the Earth. Like it will blow up to like even cover the Earth's orbit. And eventually this central core here is left behind as a white dwarf. So our sun will die as a white dwarf in about 4.5 billion years. On the other hand, if it is a massive star, it will explode as a supernova after the red supergiant phase, and it will either end up as a neutron star or a black hole, depending on its mass. So these are all this all is like still a theory. Most of this is still a theory, but we have like 8 solar mass, like 8 times the. Like if the mass of the star is like more than 8 times the solar mass, then it follows this cycle. If it's less than that, it follows this cycle. And then the mass separation between neutron star and black hole is still an open question in astronomy. So the supernova remnant. This is beautiful, isn't it? Okay, before I start with galaxies, any questions, remaining questions? Okay, so let's talk about galaxies. I love galaxies. So I just brought back here the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. That's the small thing. And in this small field, we can see a lot of galaxies. Like even these small, like if you look at these small blue things here, even that's a galaxy. Like these small things, they're like really far, far away galaxies. So what like just looking at this, what are the properties that you can think of the galaxies? That what are the different types of properties that you can see of the galaxies from here? Like please, like you can just type in the chat window. Like what are the different type of properties that you can see? Anyone? No, I mean like just see. You cannot see the mass, right? Mass from here. Yeah, shape, yes, you have like different shapes of galaxies, yes. Yes, the light of the galaxies is different for different objects. Orientation is different, yes, some are face on, some are edge on. Clustered, yeah, some of them are clustered, yes. Yes, the brightness of some objects are like high and some are low. Yes, some are bluer galaxies, some are redder galaxies, color, distance, yes. So yes, thank you. So we can all see that the galaxies come in different shapes, different sizes, different colors, different brightness. So we can infer a lot of things by just looking at them. And this is what Edwin Hubble did. What he did was he just observed the galaxies and he made something called as his classification scheme. This he created in 1926, which we still use today. Even though it's not scientifically accurate, we still use it today. So basically what he divided them into ellipticals, like these objects which are mostly redder and yellower and redder in color, and they have this elliptical shape. And based on how elliptical they are divided from E0 to E7. And then we have spiral galaxies, and there are two types of spiral galaxies. There are normal spiral galaxies, and these are normal spiral galaxies. You see the spiral arms. There is this central bright thing, which is called as a bulge of a galaxy. And then based on how spiral, like how spirally the spirals are, it's divided into A, B, and C categories. And then there are barred spiral galaxies, which means that they have this bar. Bar is something called as like a huge boxy thing in the center of the galaxy, like this. Like you can see this bar here, or like a bar here and there, which are called as barred spirals. So they have a bulge, a bar, and a spiral arms, and they are called as barred spiral galaxies. And then this is an irregular thing. This was not something that Hubble added. This was something that was recently added. The irregulars are galaxies which do not have any particular shape. So I'm going to give you an exercise here. So these are different galaxies. Okay, so think about, just look at them and then mark them based on what do you think their shape is like. Please vote, like, yeah. No one is answering.
Ma'am, how to get question again? Like just to see the picture, I put the back screen, and like it got disappeared.
Let me share it again. Okay, can you see that now?
Yeah. Thank you. I have to remember the image, because if we answer the question, then we can't see the image.
Oh, can't you just move this question around?
Like we are using mobile. I'm using mobile.
Oh.
Yeah, we can move.
It's fine. If, like, don't worry about it if you cannot answer. But yeah, no one has answered, which is weird. Come on, 28 people and no one is answering. Okay, I'm going to end the poll in 30 seconds. Ten seconds. Okay, I'm going to hit the poll now. Let's see. Okay, so that's the results. So the first one is a normal spiral galaxy. The second one is an elliptical galaxy. It's basically it's an E0. It's like very compact elliptical galaxy. The third one is a barred spiral galaxy. So here you can clearly see the bar, right? This is what I mean when I say a barred galaxy. And even this, we can see the bar. So basically the spirals extend, the spirals start from the end of the bar here. You can see that. And the fourth one is an irregular galaxy, doesn't have any shape. And this is a lenticular galaxy. Oh, I'm sorry, I did not explain lenticular galaxy. So the lenticular galaxy, let me go back. Okay, so the lenticular galaxy is this S0 galaxy. Basically, it is a combination of, it's where the ellipticals meet the spirals. It has the spirals, it has the central bulge, and it has the spirals which are like very old. They are called as lenticular galaxies. So this one is a lenticular galaxy, and the last one is again an elliptical galaxy.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Which factors decides the shape of these galaxies?
So that's what all the astronomers are trying to figure out, right? That's the question that people are trying to answer. Like, how does, like, what happens that defines the shape of the galaxy? But yeah, but the spiral, but the theories that we have till now is basically the spiral galaxies are based, like you can see this spiral arms because of the velocity of the stars. The spiral galaxies are rotating, and because of the rotation, you see the spiral arms. So the spiral galaxies are rotation supported galaxies. Whereas I'm going to talk about galaxy evolution in a few slides, and then you will know that elliptical galaxies are a bit older galaxies, and what they have are like older stars. And when older stars, the stars have random motions. They do not have a fixed like velocity. So they are basically random motions of stars that are happening within the galaxy. So basically elliptical galaxies are dispersion supported galaxies rather than rotation supported. And that's why they have like this different other shape. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but like I have a curiosity on BARD one, like how that BARD is there. Like,
yeah,
which
that is
factor can make it.
Yeah, that is like still an open question in like galaxy theory. Like people still are trying to understand the BARD galaxies, but the main idea right now is that like people have this idea that this bar was actually like an elliptical galaxy, and then basically the galaxy evolved and then forming more spiral arms, and then basically the BARD galaxy is the older part of the galaxy and it was like very young, and now the spiral arms are the younger part of the galaxy where new stars are being formed.
And generally we see like spiral galaxies rotates about its center.
Yeah.
Do these BARD galaxies also rotate?
So the spiral arms are rotating, but the BARD portion of it, the bar is basically dispersion supported. The bar is like a very old stars are there in the bar. So basically there is like a random motion of stars. But if there is a supermassive black hole at the center of the galaxy, then it will be additional dispersion, additional random motion of the stars. There will be like a fixed motion near the supermassive black hole, but more random as you go outward. So it depends on the system, from system to system, basically.
But looking at the picture, it looks like a comet tail. Like it looks like tail, and this the middle one, the BARD one, is also rotating about its center. I'm not sure, but
it looks like that, right? But you cannot say anything from the looks. That's the thing.
Okay, and if like the central line or the bar doesn't rotate, then why we see that in every picture, like a two picture is being shown here. In both picture, like it has been like if it is not rotating, then that tail.
No, I mean the bar is probably rotating, but the bar is like rotating as a whole unit, because there are like a lot of galaxies lot of stars within this whole bar. I'm talking about the individual stars. I'm not talking about the bar as a whole. The bar is rotating along with the galaxy.
Okay. And one more thing, like I got a feeling like if it is like a long tail of galaxy,
Yeah.
sorry, long tail of stars, and in the center, because of anything or like whatever, if the central force of attraction is there and it is trying to move in any central way, and the gravity doesn't reaches to that farthest one, so like it is has started rotating the smaller area, the region which is nearer to the center is being rotated with the like, but the one which is far is directly coming, so that it will form this type of shapes.
I did not get your question.
Just put a long thread
Yeah.
and put like a empty pipe or hollow pipe inside that thread, and that hollow pipe and leave some area of thread outside that hollow pipe in both sides, and try to rotate that pipe around the center. Then we will see this type of picture, and that hollow pipe is area of strong gravitation, and that thread which is coming is like having less attraction as compared to that strong.
But you are assuming that it's
yeah, that's
classical
what
mechanics,
it
right?
looks like that, and every natural phenomena is in a way similar to each other. That's why I asked.
Yeah, but you're assuming that it's a classical mechanics phenomena, and then but it's a large scale phenomenon. You have dark matter as well, and then the physics will change there.
Yes.
Yes, like you have GR as GR will get added, right? And all that. Okay. So I wanted to ask that it's already 1 hour. I'm not sure how long this usually goes. Is it okay if I continue?
It's okay. It's okay. No problem.
Yeah.
Completely
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. So the next thing is, how do we study these galaxies? These galaxies come in different shapes and forms. Like, what do we want to know? So the things that we want to know about the galaxies is how do they form? What is the mass? How much stars they are forming? How are they evolving, and so on. So for this, we come back to the light. As I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, different forms of light can be used to study different aspects of the universe. So this is a same object, this is the same galaxy as observed in different wavelengths. So this first one is GALEX. It's a UV based spacecraft, space telescope. So this is observed in UV. So the UV is mostly used to study the young stars in a galaxy. Basically, we know by studying UV, we know what is called as a star formation rate. Star formation rate is how many stars or what mass of stars is formed per year. Like, for example, the star formation rate of Milky Way is about 0.03 or something like that. And then the second one is the optical regime. This is SDSS, Sloan Digital Sky Survey, which is actually happening since 2008. And it just recently released it's going to release its 17th data release. And basically, using the optical light wavelength, we can study the middle-aged stars, and which can give us the mass of the galaxy. So if we have an optical image of the galaxy, if we have optical properties of the galaxy, we can infer the mass of the galaxy. And this third one is an infrared wavelength. An infrared wavelength, the WISE here is another infrared spacecraft. And basically it stands for Wide Infrared Survey Explorer. And the infrared wavelength can give information about the old stars in a galaxy. And this last one is longer wavelengths. It's still WISE. WISE has like 4 channels, 4 different wavelengths it takes images from. So this is what is called as far infrared wavelengths. And it helps us to understand the distribution of dust in a galaxy. And all these different things we use, we combine them, and we study them to understand the galaxies and how they grow. Krishna, you have a question?
Yeah, what do we mean by dust in this context?
It's dust. It's basically mostly silicate and carbon molecules. It's dust. It's basically sand kind of particles. Silicate is like sand, right?
Yeah, that we can observe, I guess, after the later period of the star formation, because it will form basically from the nuclear fusion.
It can also form from basically not just nuclear fusion. It can form from like AGP evolution, like I did, like basically the planetary nebula phase that I talked about in stars. It can form from that as well. Dust just exists in the universe everywhere. You know, dust is like an issue to everything. It blocks light. But yeah, it can also be formed from near the AGN, like near the black holes as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have a question.
Yes.
How like we find that, like how we got to know that it is dust, like or like we can capture infrared, we can capture ultraviolet, but how we can understand it's dust there?
So basically what happens is that when the light is emitted in the galaxy, the size of the dust is comparable to the far infrared wavelengths. So basically what happens is it can, oh no, that is not correct. I'm sorry. Basically the dust preferentially absorbs light from the in the bluer parts of the spectrum, and then it emits. The temperature of the dust is closer to the Planck spectrum in the far infrared, so it emits light in that wavelength. But if you are asking how do you know it's a silicate or what kind of material the dust is made up of, what they do is they take the spectra of the light that is coming, and from the spectra of from the absorption lines and the emission lines. Basically for the dust, they measure the far infrared emission lines, and from the emission lines you can see that there are like silicate emission lines or graphite emission lines, and from there they infer that we have dust. And also since dust parts like blocks part of the light, you can also see it in like other optical images. Does that answer your question? Okay. Let's talk about active galaxies for a minute. So most of the galaxies have a supermassive black hole at its center. So even our own Milky Way has one. It is called as Sagittarius A star. In some galaxies, large amount of dust and gas is being sucked onto these black holes. And this results in a release of high amount of energy. Basically, accretion leads to energy production. And such galaxies with an accreting supermassive black hole are called as active galaxies. And this here, it shows the central region of an active galaxy, which is called as an active galactic nucleus, or AGN for short. And this region is very, very small. It is basically about 3 light years in diameter. So I think I mentioned in the beginning that the diameter of the Milky Way is 10 lakh light years. So imagine like 3 light years compared to the 10 lakh light years. So you can imagine how small this active galactic nuclear region part is. So even though these regions are that small, they actually produce more light than the whole of the stars in the galaxy combined. So Swagata, you have a question?
What is the difference between the normal galaxies and active galaxies?
The normal galaxies, like that's how I'm showing it here. The normal galaxies, they might have a supermassive black hole, but it's not active. When I say when it's active, it means that it is actually sucking up gas and dust and then producing energy. If it does not have anything to feed on, if there is no gas and no dust near the supermassive black hole for it to feed on, then it is not active. It is a normal galaxy. It is like an inactive galaxy, basically. So when you have like here, you can see that this is a normal galaxy. You can see the individual stars here. But if it's an active galaxy, the central region is so bright that it basically you cannot see anything else in this galaxy. Shivam, do you have a question?
The jet region is just energy, no matter, like no identity about the jet region.
So the jet region is still basically, so all this that I'm talking about is still theory. We are still trying to prove it. So the jet region is also like, it is both energy and matter. Some of the matter is also being released. It's mostly studied in radio waves, but we still don't know why it is produced.
If we replace the active black hole with the inactive black hole in the normal galaxy, then what will happen to the normal galaxy?
Milky Way is like, our Milky Way has a supermassive black hole at its center, and it is not active. Like Milky Way is not an active galaxy. Nothing happens. It's just that it's basically the active galaxy and an inactive galaxy. But yeah, there is questions about how the active galaxy, like the AGN, affects the galaxy evolution. So if there is an AGN, it can lead to like more luminosity. The galaxy is more brighter, but it also releases a lot of energy into the galaxy that the gas in the galaxy heats up, and because of that, the star formation stops. So like, yeah, having an AGN actually definitely influences the galaxy evolution, but yeah, that's the thing. Does that answer your question?
Okay.
Yeah. So, and these ones are so bright, these objects are like so bright that they are often called as the cosmic lighthouses. And they are so bright, like initially they were called as quasars. Like even now they are called as quasars, but it's a historical term rather than like an accurate term. So quasars are like really, really bright, some of the brightest objects in the universe. And quasars, we usually call a galaxy's quasars when they're like really, really like far away from us, like when the universe was like really young. That's and we can still see them. Those are what we call as quasars. And yeah, as I said earlier, the AGN, the active galaxies are very crucial part of the galaxy population because they influence the galaxy itself, like how the galaxy evolves. And it also influences the surroundings. Like if there are some galaxies that are around it, it can affect them as well. Let's talk about the theory of structure formation. So the universe, I'm just going to go really fast here. So I already feel like I've taken a long time. But yeah, so the basic theory is that the universe, so this is still a theory. The most accepted theory is called as the lambda CDM model of galaxy formation or structure formation. So the lambda stands for dark energy and the CDM stands for cold dark matter. So what this tells us that the universe is made up of dark energy and cold dark matter. So from the recent Planck collaboration, we got that we have like 71, the universe is made up of 71% of dark energy, 24% of dark matter, and the small amount of baryons, what we call them. Like we all are baryons, all the stars, the planets and everything are baryons. And what this theory tells us is that small objects form first, small galaxies form first, and when they combine together, they form larger and larger objects. So this is a simulation here. So So this is the simulation here, which shows this galaxy formation and evolution. Basically, you can see small galaxies here. Here, each yellow point is a star. And you can see the small galaxies combining together. They merge together to form larger and larger galaxies. And this is what is happening. Like, this is what happens in this, like, this is the theory again. This is how the galaxies, our Milky Way, formed. And what we observe because of this is that we have small galaxies that are revolving around these larger galaxies. And these small galaxies are what we call as dwarf galaxies. So these dwarf galaxies are small galaxies. They are the building blocks of the universe because they form first and then they combine together to form larger and larger galaxies. And these smaller galaxies are basically satellite galaxies because they revolve because they fall into this bigger galaxy, and they rotate and then they sink into the larger galaxy. So before being like merging into this larger galaxy, they are actually called as satellite galaxies. So this Magellanic Clouds are actually satellite galaxies of our Milky Way. There are two galaxies called as Large Magellanic Cloud, LMC, which has a mass of about 10^9. So our Milky Way has a mass of about 10^11 solar masses. So these small galaxies, you can see that they have a smaller mass, like 100 times smaller mass compared to these, the general Milky Way type galaxies. So these Magellanic Clouds are the satellite galaxies of our Milky Way. They are going to be merging with our Milky Way soon. And this Triangulum galaxy, M33, is a satellite galaxy of Andromeda. So these three are the most like studied dwarf galaxies today. But dwarf galaxies also come in many shapes. So here, Leo 5, this is another, Leo 5 is another galaxy, but you can see that it has far less amount of stars. This has about like 10^6 stars. So its mass is about 10^5 to 10^6 solar masses. And this IC 1613 is another. You can like see that it has much fainter like stars and so on. So this IC 1613 is the first galaxy that I studied. I just like last year I published a paper on this galaxy. But it can be much faint. Can you see a dwarf galaxy here? This is basically a dwarf galaxy. This whole image is basically a dwarf galaxy with the stars here. So there are only about like 100 to 200 stars in this galaxy. Like compared to 100 billion stars in our Milky Way, the small dwarf galaxy, like these stars that are marked by the circles constitute this dwarf galaxy. So you can see that as we go down in mass, these systems become so faint that it's harder to detect them. But these are very important parts of the universe. So why study these dwarf galaxies? So that's why they're important. The dwarf galaxies are building blocks of the galaxies such as our own Milky Way. So by understanding these dwarf galaxies, by understanding how they form, how they evolve, we can understand the basic questions about how our universe came to be. And then the Lambda-CDM model of galaxy formation is basically successful on large galaxy scales, but however, it fails in these small, low mass galaxies. So if we understand these low mass galaxies, we can understand, like we can make a much better, like we can generate a much better theory of understanding our galaxy formation and evolution. And these dwarf galaxies are the most numerous galaxies in the universe. Like for example, around our Milky Way itself, we have like about 100 to 200 satellite galaxies around our Milky Way. So they are like very numerous galaxies. So they help us understand the general population of the galaxies at each epoch. And also dwarf galaxies can act as tracers of dark matter. I'm not going to go into much detail with that, just like leaving it there. The questions that I personally am interested in is how do these dwarf galaxies form and evolve, and how do the star formation occur in these dwarf galaxies? So there is something called a star forming main sequence, where basically the star formation depends on the mass of the galaxy. I'm very much interested in learning how that works. And particularly right now, my research is related to do dwarf galaxies host AGN? We have seen that there are like supermassive black holes in large galaxies, but in a smaller scale, do intermediate mass black holes occur in dwarf galaxies? That's my current research. And how do the surroundings of dwarf galaxies affect their evolution? And how do these answers change with time, like would change with basically the evolution from the beginning of the universe till now? So these are the questions that I'm interested in. So I have just one slide left where I'm going to show the fate of our own Milky Way. Before that, if you have any questions.
Yeah, what do we mean by small and large galaxies here? Because everything is large here.
Comparatively, right? Everything is large compared to us, but on a cosmological scale, they are still small. Like compared to like Milky Way, that's why I was talking about. Milky Way has let's just compare with Milky Way. Milky Way has 10 power 11 stars approximately. And when I'm saying 10 power 11 stars, I'm mostly talking about assuming that I'm not just talking about the number. I'm actually relating it to mass, assuming that all the stars are like have the mass of the sun. Then the Milky Way has a mass of about 10 power 11 solar masses. But these dwarf galaxies, they have masses from about 100 to 10 power 9 solar masses. So they are like small compared to our Milky Way.
Okay.
What is the best idea for the formation of dwarf galaxies?
So basically, the best idea right now is basically they come together. It comes from the lambda CDM model that the dwarf halos, they like dark matter. Basically, due to gravitation, all these dark matter and everything come together, and then the gas cools down and they form stars all together.
So adding to what Krishna Bhai asked, what is the qualification to distinguish a galaxy? Like we only see 4 to 5% of visible whole universe that is visible to us.
Yes.
And there are a lot of separation. There might be a lot of separation between these clusters of stars, which we call as galaxies. So what, like if we see from far enough, the two cluster may be close enough, but if you zoom in, we can separate out these clusters. So what are the criteria to distinguish a galaxy and we name it as separate galaxy and distinguish from other?
You can separate galaxies from the clusters, but it's harder to get dwarf galaxies. But yeah, given the current instruments that we have, we can separate the individual galaxies. At least to a near, like it also depends on the distance the cluster is from us. Like we are still not able to separate like far away galaxies. Like I am currently studying. So we talk in astronomy. We talk about distance in terms of redshift. What it means is that, so as I said, light is a form of a time machine, right? So basically, we can see from when the universe was half an age, or like half the age that is today, or so on. So if the redshift is equal to 1, it means that the age of the universe was half. If the redshift is 2, the universe was 1/4 years old, like the quarter of the age it is today. So right now I am studying galaxies that are at a redshift of 2, which means that I am still able to separate the individual galaxies, but they are so far away that I'm not able to separate the individual stars. So basically it's like talks about the resolution of a pixel. It's similar to the like camera, and you think about resolution, right? So if it's nearby, you are able to resolve the individual stars. But if you are far away, you are able to resolve the individual galaxies. But if they are still far away, you are not able to resolve the galaxies. It's like that. Did you get that?
Yeah. So basically, this is a relative like galaxy we are defining in a relative sense only.
Yes.
How much we can separate out or resolve.
Yeah. Also, we cannot define the boundary of a galaxy, right?
Yeah.
That's
that was my core question: how we can define the boundary.
We cannot define the, like, we just think about it as a light profile, that light falls off, but it keeps falling off, but we cannot actually define a border of a galaxy.
Okay. And there was one other question, like our galaxy, Milky Way galaxy, is a spiral galaxy, and our solar system is one of its arm in the spiral.
Yeah.
So how do we actually, because if we see, we will only see a disc-like of structure when we look at the telescope, then how we can identify that this is spiral galaxy and we see pictures of our galaxy? So they are real or just a computer?
No, they are not real. We cannot take the image of our own Milky Way, right? No, those are just artist impressions. We can, however, see the Milky Way from, like, if you go out in the dark, like into a dark night, you can actually see the Milky Way, and it's beautiful. You should try sometimes where there's no light pollution. You can see the Milky Way from the Earth, and it's beautiful, but you cannot see the whole galaxy. Like, you can see like the spiral arms.
Okay.
Yeah. Vaibhav, you had a question?
Yeah, so I had two not full questions but queries, but both of which just moments ago were like kind of discussed. First was regarding how we define separate the galaxies, because just now we discussed this dwarf galaxy wherein we had just a handful of number of stars, hundreds, and we have galaxies with billions of stars also. So this question cropped in. How do we define, which we already discussed. Another one was again that most of the stars, when we see, like we saw M33 galaxy and the Milky Way, whenever we visualize, is it all the stars fall in almost in a plane, or they are more of a 3D structure, like a nucleus of a like the nucleus and electrons, or in a more haphazard manner, or they are like most of the stars would fall in a elliptical plane, something like this?
So it depends on the galaxy. Basically, if it's a young galaxy, then it's like, basically it requires the angular momentum. It's like a theoretical point of view and everything, but the angular momentum conservation requires it to be in a disk. That's why most of the spiral galaxies are disky galaxies, but that does not mean that there is nothing above and below. It's the disk contains most of the stars, but there is like a 3D structure that there are some stars above and below. There is gas and dust above and below the galaxy. But elliptical galaxies are more spheroidal. They are like more like a ball or an oval, like elongated football kind of thing. But yeah, it's a 3D structure. It's not a 2D structure.
Sure. That actually started from that example when we had that question around hollow pipe and a ring through it.
Yeah.
That was the moment when I started to visualize it, and so this came. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Krishna, you had a question?
Oh, I had a question regarding what is the redshift of 2 means?
So basically, okay. I did not talk about this, but basically redshift, I talked about redshift earlier, right? The Doppler shift and redshift.
Yeah.
So it's kind of related to that, but if you remember, I did not mention it in this talk, but Hubble actually measured the galaxy's distance and velocities, and he found that the farther the galaxy is from us, it is moving, all the galaxies are moving away from us. And the farther the galaxy is, the faster it is moving away from us. So since the galaxy is moving away from us, when we look at its spectra, there is a redshift there.
Yeah.
And that redshift is like how, so basically the farther away it is from us, the higher the redshift.
Okay.
So basically astronomers use this term to basically think about the age of the universe at that time. So redshift of 2 means that it is further away such that it produces a redshift of like something like 2 times something like that. It's a theoretical construct for astronomers to study galaxies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So now I'm going to show a little video. This is going to be the last slide, but this is the fate of our Milky Way. So this was basically done by one of my collaborators here. She found out, like, I'm sure that you have already heard about this, but in 4.5 billion years, Milky Way and Andromeda are going to merge together to form a bigger galaxy. So that's what I'm going to show here. Oops, wait, sorry. Okay, so that's our Milky Way galaxy. And here it shows the time from now, basically. It's revolving. And then we have here the Andromeda galaxy, and Andromeda galaxy has the small satellite galaxy, Triangulum galaxy. And in about 3 billion years, we have the first encounter. It like comes closer together. There is an attraction force between them, and then it crosses its first path. And then the gravitational pull pulls it again. And finally, the Milky Way and Andromeda combine to form one single galaxy, with the Triangulum galaxy being the satellite galaxy of both of them together. So it's going to be interesting. In about 4.5 billion years, the sun is going to turn into a white dwarf, and then the Milky Way and Andromeda is going to collide. So it's going to be exciting.
These two big galaxies are collide, but the small satellite galaxies are left behind. So why this thing? Is there some reason?
That's how the physics works, right? Because the gravitational force is just pulling these two apart, and the gravity, it's not strong enough to attract this bigger, a smaller one.
Okay.
Okay, Dee, I have a question.
Yes.
Like earlier when I was checking out on the video related to these topics, I found that this galaxy, our Milky Way galaxy, is also moving in a helical path.
Yes.
No,
So whenever we talk about like movement, it all depends on what frame of reference we are using, right? So I have never heard of this helical path, but what sort of frame of reference are you talking about?
Like from the data which all the observatory of our Earth has received, and how the different galaxies position shifted according to the data which were detected. They said that it looks like our Milky Way galaxy is itself moving in the helical path with time. Or you can ask me, I will send you that video even.
Yeah, sure. Please send me, because it all depends on the frame of reference, right? Because helical path, yeah, I can understand, like maybe it is moving in a helical path, but in what frame of reference it is moving.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know.
Okay,
I will
you have
also
a
check into
question?
more.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Dee, I was asking that you told Milky Way galaxy will merge into another galaxy.
Yeah.
So what will be the consequences that will happen after this merge, or will there be any change in change in means pathway, or may change in the because Milky Way is helical, but will after this merge, will there be any change in its shape or something?
So if the Milky Way is helical, I'm not sure about that, but if the Milky Way is helical, then I'm pretty sure that Andromeda will also be helical, because all this local group is actually moving together. So it won't affect the path in any way, because all the local group, it's called as a local group. We have like about 200 galaxies in this local group, and all of this is moving in a similar way in this Virgo supercluster. So there won't be any change in the movement of the galaxy, but again, movement of galaxy is like a very relative term. But if you are asking about how it will affect us, as in the Earth and the stars, that won't be affected, because it's not like a solid object merging together, right? It's just like most of the space in the galaxy is empty. So nothing is going to collide when the galaxy merges. So it's in no way going to affect any stars or anything like that.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask, first of all, isn't local group made up of 32 galaxies?
Yeah, but there are also like a lot of satellite galaxies, right? We are finding a lot of satellite galaxies as well.
And
like recently, there was like I think they found satellite galaxies for our satellite galaxies. Like I told, like Magellanic Clouds are the satellite galaxies of Milky Way, right? They found like 10 satellite galaxies of these Magellanic Clouds. So it's like still an increasing number. We don't have like a fixed number yet.
Okay, so when they say 32, they mean the major galaxies.
Major galaxies, yes. Like you say that, like that we say that Andromeda is the nearest galaxy to us, but in fact, there are like a satellite. Magellanic Clouds are the nearest galaxies to us, but they are smaller galaxies, right?
And one more thing, in that relativistic jet which was shooting out of the black hole, I mean, I saw something labeled as shock. What was that?
So basically, when there is a shock is a theoretical construct again. Basically, it's a pressure. How do I explain it? So basically, it's like when it is releasing a jet, it produces a shock wave or something called as a pressure wave, which will affect the medium around it. It's kind of a pressure wave. Yeah.
Maybe when the like speed of wave is more than the local speed of sound.
Yes. Yes. That is correct. Yeah. Okay. Swaraj, can you tell me what the mistake was? Is it related to the helical thing?
Yeah, actually, we are moving in the helical path, not the whole Milky Way.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me for this talk.